Hello friends, I hope everyone is doing well today. I apologize for not having this video recorded and up yesterday. Sometimes technical things are not necessarily my forte, but we've got everything up and running today, so it seems. I see myself on the screen as I am talking into it, which feels good. And today we're going to talk a little bit about point of view and who's telling the story. So please have your textbooks handy and available so we can kind of work through things together on this. And this is important stuff to talk about narration. And it is stuff that occasionally students feel is common sense, that it's just something that you know by writing, is that there is a narration that occurs over the course of it. And that's a little more simple than it actually is. So what we're going to talk about today is what actually it means when we talk about who's telling the story and how reliable they are. So let's first talk about what a narrator is. And the book gives us an idea of a narrator and what it means. On 190, it tells us that we'll define narration. It's important to understand that only in fiction a narrator is different than the author. This is really important. One of the first things that we need to think about when we are discussing narration is that the idea of a narrator is a construct. This is an artificial thing that we create in fiction. That there is a difference between who is writing the story and who is telling it. In the book The Lie That Tells the Truth by John Dufresne, a terrific fiction writer, he breaks it down like this. The author writes the story, the narrator tells it. One of the author's first obligations is to create this storyteller, this persona. So think about this, right? When you're writing a story, you are creating everything, including who is telling it. It might feel like, well, obviously, I'm telling the story, but you're not. Even when it is a detached third person, it's not really you. There's always a construct that's at work that's creating this. And I think that this is a really important thing for us to remember as writers, that sometimes we kind of overlook the narration. It just sort of exists and we do it and that's where it ends. But it's something that should be much more conscious than that. Now, I don't want to give you more things to stress about when you're writing, but it's so crucially important for us to keep in mind that the narration that we're creating is a deliberate choice. And now, since it is a deliberate choice, let's think deliberately about it. And the narration style, the point of view, the reliability of the narrator, these are all things that we can control as writers, and we should control. And I think sometimes we kind of don't think about it. Maybe we'll think, hey, I wonder if this should be first person or third person, and that's where our decisions sort of end. But that's where they should begin, because there's a lot more that's going on with this. So let's talk about the different narrations. I think you probably know them. I think we've already defined them on the first week, but I think it's worth getting into a little bit more here. First person. A first-person narration is a narration that has an I, right? I did this, I did that. It's a construct. So when you are writing in fiction, the I is not you. Even if you're writing something that ostensibly is like a fictionalized version of yourself, it's still fiction. It's still an artifice. So when we are creating the first person, it is crucial for us to know who that I is. We need to understand who the speaker is, what they know, what they need to know, what their agenda is, what they're looking to tell the reader. So it's really crucial to think about why you're using a first person versus a third person. And of course, the third person is the they did this, they did that. So it's somebody else telling the story. Again, it's a construct, so it's still somebody that's there. Maybe they're not putting an opinion on the course of the things that happen in the story of the novel, but somebody exists to tell the story, even if we don't consciously know who that is. Again, this is important. So it's a matter of figuring out which one we want to use. What's gained from having a first person versus a third person? Talk about that. I'd love to hear in your comments below comments about which one you favor. Do you feel more comfortable with first versus third? I balance them off. In my own writing, I will have some occurrences of first and some occurrences of third. Before I came to talk to you today and sit down at my desk and stare into a computer screen, before I did that, I looked over some of my own stories and some of my own manuscripts. And honestly, it's about 50-50 for me. Some are first, some are third. I probably typically feel a little more comfortable with first person because of my writing style. It's a little chattier and personable. And so to me, it often feels a little more in my wheelhouse, to use the expression, to write in first person, because I can have somebody just sort of riff a little bit. But I use both, and I like both because I think both can give us different things in different ways. I think what a first person narration can do, and again, I would love to get your feedback on what you think is beneficial about using the first person below, is that I can get a greater insight into a person by understanding who they are and how they think. Obviously, in a third person narration, I'm going to get to know plenty about what a person thinks, obviously. If it's a close third person. If we're talking about something that gives us a central character, even if it is in the third person, probably I'm going to get a sense of what that character is thinking and feeling. Maybe I'm getting a sense of what other characters are thinking and feeling, which I can't in first person. So what first person can do is give me an intimacy with a character that maybe I can't feel. Even in a third person that is very closely focused upon an individual, I still aren't going to feel like I really am in their heads and know them. Now think about works of literature that maybe we've read. Harry Potter. What's Harry Potter? Is it first person or third? You can't answer me. Maybe you did. Maybe you did aloud right now. It's third, right? It's third. And what about Twilight? Yeah, I'm referencing Twilight. Whatever, come at me. Twilight, is it first or third? It's first, right? It's first person. We spend so much time in Bella's head in the first book that it's frightening, frankly. And what's gained from that? Well, we get an insight into her motivations, into what's going on within her. We don't in Harry Potter in the same way. I mean, we do because we know we're very focused on him, but the narration style allows us to kind of move around. Think about this with narration. What changes if a book or a story is written in a different style? What if Harry Potter was written in first person narration from Harry's perspective? What changes? Does anything? Yeah, right? There are moments where we move around and see different things. Now, if we had the first person narration, we could get in Harry's head and maybe he can see things that Voldemort is doing at different points, but we wouldn't have the free range of Hogwarts that we do, even if we mostly see it all from Harry's perspective. What else would change? Well, book 5 might start in a pretty insufferable way as Harry gets a little more belligerent at times and a little insufferable, but we're able to kind of get the distance between that. And I don't really mean that. Book 5 is my favorite. Don't get mad at me. And so these are things that change. With Twilight, one thing that Myers is able to do is that she shifts the point of view. So we have some books that give us Bella's perspective and then switch over to Jacob's perspective or whatever else. I can't say that I've been thinking that deeply about Twilight here in 2019. But the perspective does shift. So it gives us insight into different characters. It creates an intimacy that's important. It also can lead to unique kinds of mysteries. I want to read just the first paragraph of the first story in George Saunders' collection, Pastoralia. And it has a first-person narration. You'll know because of the first word, which is I. Gives us a good clue, right? I have to admit, I'm not feeling my best. Not that I'm doing so bad. Not that I really have anything to complain about. Not that I would actually verbally complain if I did have something to complain about. No, because I'm thinking positive, staying positive. I'm sitting back on my haunches, waiting for people to poke in their heads. Although it's been 13 days since anyone poked in their head, and Janet's speaking English to me more and more, which is part of why I feel so, crummy. First person narration. Would that feel different if we had a third person narration? Well, yeah, right? I mean, probably that third person narration would feel compelled to give us some setup for what's going on. But as it is, by just having this personality driven first person narrator, the reader is intrigued, I think, because I'm wondering what the heck is going on. But I'm also confused because there's this layer of remove between me and what this narrator is actually talking about. This is one thing that first person can do. This is why it's popular. Listen to how conversational Saunders is able to do this. And Saunders is one of our best short story writers. And one of the reasons that he's so good is because there is a comfortable tone to it, even when I'm confused, right? There's a familiarity to the language of this, even if I don't really have a clue as to what Saunders is talking about, or I'm sorry, what Saunders' narrator, the speaker, the character is talking about here. It goes on. Geez, she says first thing this morning. I'm so tired of roast goat, I could scream. What am I supposed to say to that? It puts me in a bad spot. She thinks I'm a goody-goody, and then her speaking English makes me uncomfortable. And she's right, it does. Because we've got it good. Every moment a new goat, just killed, sits in our big slot. The story as it unfolds gives us more insight as to what's going on. But purposefully, Saunders here is giving us the perspective of the speaker as our way in. And purposefully, we don't understand everything the speaker's talking about. The speaker is not interested in giving us a backstory at this stage because the speaker is living the life that the speaker is living. So think about the way that this can work. That sometimes the speaker will give us all sorts of insight into who they are right at the beginning. And other times, the speaker will just allow us to ride along. These are all choices that we get to make as we go on, right? In the textbook, there are examples of these first-person narrators. Now, one of the first-person narrations that is impossible to not talk about when we talk about first-person narration is the idea of the detached first-person narrator. Now, the detached first-person narrator is an example of a character in the story who is ostensibly not the central protagonist of the novel or the story, who is telling the story. So the most famous example of this is, of course, The Great Gatsby, although there are plenty of other examples in literature too. Beyond F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, we can also look at William Styron's Sophie's Choice that does this too, among many others. This would be a supporting character who is given the reins of narration. So on page 191, it gives us the example of Nick Carraway here, and I just want to read this so we can kind of think about what's going on here. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician, because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forgot that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Now, what's interesting here is think about the beginning of that George Saunders book. The George Saunders story is a central character who is revealing what he's feeling at these moments without any regard to the idea of telling a story. Nick Carraway is telling a story. And what Nick Carraway is doing at the beginning of this passage that we just read from The Great Gatsby is explaining his perspective as a storyteller, right? So this is a very conscious movement into a first person. This is not a matter of a narrator that begins with cryptically explaining what's going on literally around them. It's a narrator who is saying, here's the kind of observer I am. Here's the kind of storyteller I am. This is what I'm getting into, and this is what you're going to follow me into. This is important. Now, the question that the book then jumps to is the logical question with The Great Gatsby. And I don't know how many of us have read it. Alice LaPlante tells us that almost every American has read The Great Gatsby at one point or another. Maybe many of you have. I've probably read it 4 or 5 times. I've seen the film versions. It's an inescapable thing in American lit. If you're an English major and you haven't read it yet, hold on. You probably will. It's fine. It's good. You'll like it. But whose story is it? That's the question. And this is a question that comes up a lot when it involves first-person narrations. Does this mean that this is Nick Carraway's story because he's the one telling it? Does that mean that because Nick Carraway is the one who's giving us the details that we're focusing upon, that Nick Carraway is the one who is choosing the trees, to use the metaphor that she uses elsewhere in the book, that Nick Carraway is the one choosing the trees and choosing how to examine the conflict, that everything is coming from his perspective? Does that make him the owner of the story? Or because Gatsby and Daisy are the ones that we spend the most time with in the story in terms of the narrative action. Obviously, the most time we spend with it is Nick. But because Gatsby is the title character and Gatsby is the one that we see in these active moments, is it his story? Because it's about the rise and fall of Jay Gatsby. Does that make him the owner of the story? It's a tricky one to answer. I think that ultimately, and LaPlante kind of agrees with this in here, that ultimately the story really revolves around Nick. That's a direct quote from our book. Despite, this is on the first full paragraph on 193. As it turns out, the book really revolves around Nick. Despite all his disclaimers that he's just an innocent bystander, it's about Nick's involvement in the events of the summer and his propensity to fool himself by calling himself honest. By the end of the book, it's the impact of the events on Nick that matters, on his moral fiber, on his ability to think honestly about himself. But a reasonable reader could go into this and say, no. This story is about Jay Gatsby. This is about the rise and fall of the American dream. This is about the passions that can drive somebody and that can ultimately destroy them. And Nick Carraway is a device that's getting us to tell the story. Those are both reasonable. But it's important when you're looking at a story to tell us whose it is and to think about how it works. We'll talk about third person in great detail. Before we get into that, on 194 we talk about second person. This isn't particularly common. Right? Second person indicates you. When you see a you in a story, there are a few different yous that it can be. Typically, when I find you in a story, and I don't see it as often in this form as I would in like poetry, but when I see you in something, it's typically referring to the speaker themselves, right? It would typically be a reference to me, but I'm using you to do it. I see this often in nonfiction too. Like when you walk into the room, you can smell my grandmother's apple pie. Well, you're talking about yourself. Just say I. You don't need to do any of this point of view trickery. Just say I. So often when you appears, it is standing in for the speaker. That's the first use of you that the book lists. The second is referring to a specific character. That if there is a you that is existing, that perhaps it is referring to a character that's there. Now, think about our mayonnaise story. The mayonnaise story was told in first person, but it could have been told in first person and second person if she decided that she being the narrator, not the writer, if the narrator decided that the story should be told directly to the man who's asking to borrow the mayonnaise and he becomes the you, then that would be referring to a specific character. So the piece, in effect, becomes a monologue addressed to a person or persons. For example, David, you didn't realize how much damage you could cause. You obviously weren't thinking when you stole that letter from my desk. That story becomes a direct address to David. Now, in a novel form, it might be difficult to sustain this. Probably it would be easier to do in short stories, and I've certainly seen a handful of short stories that use this device. The you is a direct address to the reader, and you people who are reading this book, ... Not super common, right? But this idea of the you ultimately being active in what's going on. This is probably going to be more common in nonfiction, again, than it is in fiction. And then finally, the U can be an attempt to turn the reader into an active character in the story. I guess this would be the choose your own adventure style of second person narration. Which door should you go through? If you want to go through the red door, turn to page 33. And if you want to go through the blue door, turn to page 18. If you don't know what choose your own adventure stories are, I guess I should define that. These are stories that were around when I was a kid that were all written in the second person, and instead of reading them linearly from the first page to the last, there would be choices that would pop up along the way. It's pretty cool. It's probably not a wildly respected form of high literature now, but still pretty cool. So those are the basics of the second person. It has its device, but it isn't necessarily something that we use a ton in this day and age. It's gimmicky, right? One thing about first and third is we don't think much about them when they arrive. When we see the I speaking, or we see the he, she, they discussion, we don't really bat an eye. When it's a direct you, I get a little off put. I'm a little confused. So that's why. So third person. If first person is the most commonly used, third person is the most complex. And maybe that's why first person gets used more often, because third person is a little bit more complex. Well, what's complex about it? The book begins the discussion of the complexity right here with the limited third person and how it moves. So we can have a third-person narration that is omniscient and godlike, or we can have one that is a direct observer, fly-on-the-wall type style. So what does that mean? So we can have a narration that gets really, really intimate and very, very close to who's talking, so that basically we are in that character's head without hearing their first-person thoughts. So we're right there with that. Or we can branch out really, really far. And we can get a narration that is able to know and understand everything that's going on in the world, so that we can have an awareness of everything that's going on without losing track of individual characters. So this narrator can know everything that's happening, but also know what's going on within this person's head, and also what's going on in this location far away. So we can do that. So, as the book says, the third person point of view is actually a continuum of possible narrators based on how much the third person narrator knows. That's what that continuum is. So you have to decide what your narrator knows. Don't just make this decision out of convenience, right? In the same way that we're cautious sometimes when we write genre fiction, we want to make sure that we've established rules. This is not a knock against genre fiction. I'm all on board. Don't worry. But one thing that can happen sometimes is that a writer can come up with a new contrivance for a character and write themselves out of a situation. We can do the same thing with the third person narration. That we can just all of a sudden decide that our narrator knows something that maybe they wouldn't have known a few pages earlier. And so it's useful for us to kind of get a sense of it. So let's take a look at the different kinds of narrations. And I like to read these because I think it's helpful for us to hear them aloud. Maybe you're reading this on your own aloud, but when I have a chance to read Jane Austen or Ernest Hemingway, I'm going to do it. So let's read the first one. This is a passage from Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen on 197. Elizabeth listened in silence, but was not convinced. Their behavior at the assembly had been calculated to please in general, and with more quickness of observation and less pliancy of temper than her sister, and with a judgment too unassailed by any attention to herself, she was very little disposed to approve them. They were in fact very fine ladies, not deficient in good humor when they were pleased, not in the power of being agreeable when they chose it, but proud and conceited. They were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the finest private seminaries in town, had a fortune of £20,000, were in the habit of spending more than they ought and of associating with people of rank, and were therefore in every respect entitled to think well of themselves and meanly of others. They were of a respectable family in the north of England, a circumstance more deeply impressed on their memories than that their brother's fortune and their own had been acquired by trade. Mr. Bingley inherited property to the amount of nearly £100,000 from his father, who had intended to purchase an estate, but did not live to do it. Mr. Bingley intended it likewise, and sometimes made choice of his country, But as he was now provided with a good house and the liberty of a manor, it was doubtful to many of those who best knew the uneasiness of his temper, whether he might not spend the remainder of his days at Netherfield and leave the next generation to purchase. So look at the way we're moving, right? We move from Elizabeth to other characters as we go on, all kind of in this perspective. Now, we're always kind of looking at it from Elizabeth's perspective in this passage, but it's kind of moving in such a way that it's giving us insight into everything. Now, when we talked about details before, a lot of you were apprehensive about details. Some of you told me that you don't really feel comfortable. It's not something you kind of default to. You kind of have to force yourself to get into details. Obviously, in previous generations, and Austen's would be one of those, that details were looked at differently, that we are getting a lot of insight into these different characters. It's all kind of in the service of Elizabeth to a degree, but it's and her perspective and the way she's viewing these characters, but it is giving us a lot. But that's one thing that this very omniscient, all-knowing narrator is able to do. Move from perspective to perspective. Is there a value that's given by this narrator toward the things that we're seeing? I think you can argue a little bit. I think that it's the value that Elizabeth would be giving things that is helping us understand how to view this stuff. So I don't think the narrator is completely and thoroughly neutral, although essentially it is, right? And then there's the other end of the continuum. It's the direct observer. So we go from this narrator who can see and understand everything that's going on from afar. We're just bouncing in the Austen passage from here to here to here to here. And look, you can't even see it, but I'm still doing it. It's still moving. Oh, there, it's all the way over there. In the Hemingway story, it doesn't do that. And we'll probably talk about the Hemingway story later on and then in this semester. And then when we do, we can have another story that my wife doesn't like at all. And then you can take her side because that seems to be what you did, and I'm cool with that. Hills like white elephants. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. On this side, there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between two lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station, there was the warm shadow of the building and a curtain made out of bamboo beads hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. The American and the girl with him sat at a table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot, and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this junction for 2 minutes and went on to Madrid. So we're really up close, right? We're seeing just the things that these characters can see. We are just in the perspective and the general world that they're in. As the narrator, or as the book says, this narration is pretty unusual. Most narrators, especially in short fiction, are closer to the middle. So we wouldn't necessarily get a narrator that knows everything, nor would we get a narrator that knows only what the speakers, the characters in the story know. It would be something more in the middle, and that makes sense, right? So she then proceeds. One of the things I love about this book is that she kind of talks smack about other books of writing. It's pretty cool. Here's another case where many of the books about writing don't serve you very well. As we explained above, there are many variations of limited third-person narrators, yet in most writing books, limited third-person is said to be the case when the knowledge of the narrator is limited to the heart and mind of a single character. But there are many ways a narrator's knowledge can be less than that possessed by an omniscient narrator. Here are just a few. It can be limited to just the thoughts of a character, but not the emotion, right? That we can know what a character's thinking, but we don't know what they're feeling in those moments. It can see beyond those thoughts and actually perceive the emotions. We can do that. It can peek into the subconsciousness of a character, things that the characters themselves are not even aware of, but have powers to relate to past events. So even having this narrator that is limited and only looking at one character and being pretty intimate into that one character, even that doesn't tell us everything. Because what are we getting? Are we getting an understanding of the character's thoughts, the character's feelings, or as she's also saying here, the things that the character themselves doesn't even fully know? Right? So once we get an understanding of that, we can proceed and move forward with these different aspects. So we need to make sure we have a sense of this, and choosing the point of view is really important. On 203, she talks about this. Why would you do these different things? There are conventionally accepted pros and cons for each kind of point of view. And again, I would love to hear yours, based on your experiences and the writing that you've done, including those of you who have already workshopped stories. Tell us, Why did you choose the narration? Did it feel like it chose you? And if it was more conscious than that, what was the decision? What drove you toward this? So why would we use first person? Well, conventionally stated advantage of this is that it provides immediacy, involves the reader, pulls him or her in, is helpful in getting sympathy for the main character, who happens to be the narrator. That's kind of what happens with that George Saunders story that we read, right? The first couple paragraphs. It does create an immediacy right away. It certainly is intriguing in that case because I don't fully know what's going on, and the narrator isn't that interested in catching me up on everything that's gone down. The disadvantage is that it's limited. Everything is filtered through only the eyes, ears, and brains of one character. So we can see very quickly what disadvantages would be. That if you're writing something that you want to see as very large in scope, especially if we're writing a world-building genre novel, it might be tricky to do first person because then you're limited to what that one person is able to see and do. That's why a lot of those books are not first person. They're moving around and kind of picking us up in different parts of the universe. Are there ways of creating a story that is large in scope but does only focus on one character? Of course. But it's a matter of kind of figuring out how you can deal with that. Another disadvantage she talks about is it possible to be too close to a story? And when we talk about unreliable narrators in a minute, we'll get into this. When you're working in a very emotionally charged situation, putting in first person can work against you because you can risk losing your reader. Is it possible we can get too intimately involved based on the things that the first person narrator is going through? I think that makes sense. So with an omniscient narrator, the advantage is that you have that big window onto the terrain of the story. We're in the second full paragraph on 204. Your readers can see it all, do all, go back to the beginning of time, take time out to give a lecture on nautical knots, like in the shipping news, or the correct way to skin a whale, Moby Dick, or whatever else you choose. Right? So we can get all that. We can move in all these different directions. There is no breaking of the rules because there aren't any, because I can do whatever I want. The conventionally accepted disadvantage of an omniscient narrator is that it can be too much, give too much information, distract the reader from what really matters in the story and what your reader really wants to know. Based on our discussion on detail last time, I think a lot of us would probably be apprehensive about the omniscient narrator because we got concerned with overwhelming our readers. And maybe some of those feelings about getting overwhelmed by too much comes from reading Moby Dick and learning more about the whaling industry than actual narrative structure. It's not really fair. Then like the character building in it. It's a great novel. It's one of the most important novels, certainly in American history. But it's also a novel that is, I think, difficult for the contemporary audience because it gets what we would see off topic a lot, even if it's probably unfair to say that to Melville because he was on topic. And what he wanted to write about was the whaling industry in some detail. So think about the types of point of view that you can use, the types of things that you can do with it. And then let's talk a little bit about narrator reliability. And I'm curious to talk to you about this and see if this is something that you've thought about. But sometimes when we read, we trust. And sometimes we shouldn't, right? Think back again to that opening of Pastoralia I told you about. Is this a reliable narrator? Well, I think that the narrator of this piece is trying to tell the truth. But it isn't just a matter of a narrator who doesn't understand things. It's a narrator who is not as informed as an omniscient narrator would be. And so then it becomes a little bit challenging in that regard. So now that you understand the different point of view choices, we are now in tool 234, and how they can vary according to knowledge and distance. You come to the issue of reliability. Okay, this narrator is telling me a story. How trustworthy is he or she? How much of this story do I believe? Now, this can be a narrative tool, right? This is not a matter, we're not writing creative nonfiction. If this was creative nonfiction and we had an unreliable narrator, then everything will fall apart and Oprah will get mad at us. Do I have to explain the reference? Maybe I do. There was a very famous creative nonfiction work that came out many years ago called, I think it was A Million Little Pieces by James Fry. And this book was a massive success. I was working at a large corporate bookstore at the time of this release. And so I am aware of how popular this book was. Now, James Fry took liberties with certain things that happened. And by taking liberties, I mean he made a lot of stuff up. Evidently, he discussed time that he spent in jail and padded it so it was much longer and more significant than it was. He created relationships with certain characters that in reality didn't really happen. Evidently, he tried to pass it off as fiction, and nobody wanted to publish it as fiction. It was a time, and that time still continues, that creative nonfiction was a little bit easier to sell. So Oprah had a show back then, and Winfrey, are familiar with her work? Oprah had a show at this point, and she had at one point hosted James Fry to talk about the book. And then once these issues of lying, of unreliability started to pop up, she had him back on the show. And I remember watching this once with my roommate. And I didn't really watch Oprah's show all that much back in the day, but I had to watch this one because this one is something that I knew someday, decade later, I would be talking about on a TV screen to a group of people who are nodding in agreement, even if I can't see them doing so. And Oprah basically just blasted him for the entire time for embellishing the story and for making things up. It was the most uncomfortable thing that I've probably seen on TV, and I couldn't really look away from it, which was Oprah over and over again berating this guy, and then him saying, I'm sorry, over and over again. It was amazing television. Oprah was judging the integrity of his story, and she was unhappy with it because to her, he was not being truthful. Now, the problem for James Fry is that she's right, he wasn't being truthful, and he was in a genre that expected truthfulness. And so he got in trouble as a result of that. In fiction, we're not in a genre that expects truthfulness. In fact, we're in a genre that celebrates making stuff up, because that's what we do. And so when we're judging the integrity of stories here, we're judging the level of characters. Remember when I read that one section from the Emergency story about the character who is it's snowing and he's looking around and he's in a cemetery, a military graveyard, and he's looking around. He's like, man, I've never seen this military graveyard before. This is amazing. He's the narrator. He's the first person narrator. And he's saying this and he's amazed. It's like, wow, I've never seen this before. How could this be? And then his friend says, well, we're in a drive-in and they're still playing a movie even though it's snowing. And then the narrator's like, oh yeah, okay, I'm sorry. I got confused. He's unreliable. He's unreliable because he's on lots and lots of drugs in that story. And so we can't quite trust what he's saying. But there are varying degrees of unreliable narrators. And it's fine for us to get to play with that. And as the book says, there's going to be a limitation that exists for every narrator. So every narrator is going to inherently have limitations. The book kind of lists some of the limitations that we're going to have, right? So let's talk about what a first-person narrator is limited by. Geography. This narrator can only be in one place at a time. Perhaps we can have conceits, at least in science fiction or fantasy genre, in which a character can somehow see stuff that's going on elsewhere. That's possible. This is okay because the characters can do other things, but this is a limitation. A narrator can only exist in one time period, specifically at a time, likely. Though probably moving from different time periods isn't going to be effective unless we're remembering things, but we're going to get to that. Physical, the narrator is limited by his or her human or otherwise body and the abilities of that body. Intellectual, the narrator's intellect almost certainly has limitations, even if he or she is highly intelligent. Nick Carraway is a very intelligent figure in Great Gatsby, but there are limits to what he knows. And this is important, right? If all of a sudden we get to a point in which a narrator knows things that they should not know, as a reader, I'm going to feel betrayed. And so you want to make sure you understand that. Experiential. The narrator can only have so much knowledge of the world, only so much personal experience. If your narrator suddenly has done and been everywhere and knows everything, I'm not going to buy it. And so we have to make sure we build in these limitations. Moral, spiritual. The narrator can be quite intelligent and experienced, but morally deficient. Certainly that happens. That we can have characters that are compelling but morally deficient. There's a lot of that. And emotional. What we frequently refer today as emotional intelligence can figure into a character's abilities and limitations. So these are the limitations that we have to respond to. We have to be aware of these types of things that exist. But then think about what our narrator can do, right? Our narrator can remember things. Our narrator can think about things that are going on. A narrator can move from one location to another. So just because our narrator isn't able to literally travel in time doesn't mean that our narrator can't remember something that happened in the past or look at it from a different perspective. But it's really useful for us to think about the reliability of narrators, not just in terms of what is made up, but also just what it can't be told and what we can't really get into. So this applies to third-person narration as well, right? When a third-person narrator, and we're on 238 now, right underneath third-person point of view and reliability. When a third-person narrator tells us something about a story, it is by convention always true. It has to be, right? It has to be always true. Take a moment to think about this. Remember, if it's not a character with flaws, like with a first-person narrator. No, this is an outsider who is not involved in the story. Not a human character, but a disembodied intelligence who is telling us about the events of the story. And when the third-person narrator speaks, according to convention, it is always the truth. Right? It has to be. So she gives us the beginning of Kafka's The Metamorphosis. When Gregor Samson woke up one morning from unsettling dreams, he found himself changed in his bed to a monstrous vermin. He was lying on his back as hard as armor plate, and when he lifted his head a little, he saw his vaulted brown belly, sectioned by arch-shaped ribs, to whose dome the cover, about to slide off completely, could barely cling. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the rest of him, were waving helplessly before his eyes. What's happened to me? He thought. It was no dream. So, we trust this, right? We have to. If Kafka would have made this first person, we would not have trusted it. We would not have believed that Gregor Samsa was going through this experience. We would not have. If it was, I woke up one morning from unsettling dreams and found myself changed into a monstrous vermin. I was lying on my back as hard as armor plate, and when I lifted my head a little, I saw my vaunted brown belly sectioned by arch-shaped ribs, to whose dome the cover almost slid off completely and could barely cling. My many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of me, were waving helplessly before my eyes. What's happened to me? I thought. I don't think it was a dream. Or it was no dream, if I just say it more directly. Do I believe that? I'm thinking, well, it must be a dream, because how could it not be? But in this case, we have to trust the narrator. People don't turn into cockroaches overnight, as Lapin tells us very, very helpfully. We know this, yet it's a third-person narrator. How do we make sense of a story that begins like this? And then she gives us the 4 options, and this is crucial. This is a surreal story, but it's a story that I have to see as real because the narrator told me, and I trust third-person narrators. Perhaps we're in a world where this implausible, improbable, unbelievable thing is real. We're getting a willing suspension of disbelief. That we just believe it. It can happen. This has happened. This is what it is. Maybe we are in the character's mind. Maybe this isn't literal, but this is a third-person narration that's just deeply embedded in the character's mind. Maybe we're in metafiction, mocking the conventions and turning convention on their heads. Or maybe the author made a mistake. Oops, people can't turn into cockroaches. This would be really bad. This is not what's happening with Kafka. But this does happen, right? That we can have something that we put into a story, and it turns out that, like, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I forgot that can't happen. Obviously, that's not the case with Kafka. Kafka is a strange and brilliant writer that does odd things in his stories all the time. But things can happen. So I like thinking about those 4 things that will allow us to understand how we can trust a narrator in a situation in which we can't trust them. I actually spent a month in the Czech Republic, and in Prague specifically, where Kafka is from. And during that time, I got to walk through Kafka's Prague, and it's so different. The relationship with writers was just so different in that city. There was a statue somewhere in downtown Prague of Kafka, but it was very surreal. Again, this is the person that wrote the story about the man turning into a cockroach overnight. And in the statue, it was a normal man standing there, but his head was flipped over and kind of floating a little bit above the rest of his body, and just said underneath, Franz Kafka, which is, I assume, not what he looked like in real life. I also went to a Kafka museum, which was just the most surreal, strange experience I've ever been to. I went with some friends, and they had to leave, and I wouldn't leave because I was too interested in what was waiting for me around every corner. Strange things. I just walk into a room that would be completely black with this strange glowing thing in the corner, and it wouldn't have any bearing on anything, but it kind of did. And I finally I went to Kafka's grave. I had to take a lot of trains to get there, but I went on my own. I was supposed to go with a friend, and he bailed on me. And I'm like, I'm going by myself. And I walked a very long way to get to Kafka's grave. And I had been through so many surreal experiences following Kafka around Prague that I was expecting the same thing. But then when I got to his grave, it was just with all the other stones that was there. There were no people around anywhere, and I sat by myself and I watched the ants walk around Kafka's tombstone, and I thought, wow, I guess he was more ordinary in these ways than I thought, because this is the same treatment we'd give everybody else. But then I'd go back to downtown and it wouldn't feel that way. So leave comments below about how you think about narration. As I said earlier, tell me how you view first person versus third person, which one you favor and why, and I would love to talk about that and get into that. Obviously, yesterday you noticed that I posted a comment on our Canvas page that was filled with some desperation. Sam is going to be giving me something by the end of the week. Thanks, Sam. Hey, cool. But no one else has let me know anything. I would love to make sure we can get something else for our workshop. These workshops depend upon material, and I know a lot of us are not super confident. But trust me, getting through this is a great experience. Even if you don't feel like you have something that's 100% ready, it's a rough draft. I don't want us to turn in work that is 100% perfect. That defeats the entire purpose of workshop. Give me something that's almost there, and we can talk about it. Obviously, if you want to volunteer for a later spot, I'm down with that. That would mean that I probably have fewer desperate Canvas messages to send out. But let's make sure we get some stuff. So if one of you are listening to me, and I don't know who, one of you, and you know who you are, and I'm looking at you right now. It's a direct address to you. If you're close, let's try to finish it up by Friday. And if you even need maybe by the afternoon on Friday, I'm okay with that. But we just need to get some things together so that we can have some work to discuss and talk about. I can find other things to discuss, but I don't want to. I want to reserve these workshop times for workshop. So let's try to find something if you can, and then contact me. And if you're kind of on the fence about it, if you're not sure if something you have is going to be good enough, let me know, and I can do what I can to help you out. Obviously, I'll do my best to encourage you, but I'm not going to make anybody do anything they're uncomfortable with. We're all going to have to workshop. I just don't want to run out of time. I know it feels early in the semester, but with this every other week thing, we don't have as many specific in-class meetings, so I want to make sure we do it. But I'll stop begging. It's unbecoming. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to your comments below, and I'll see you in class on Wednesday of next week. Thanks all.